Good afternoon, my friends. Today we will discuss the day of the beginning of the campaign of the Spanish Armada against England. The Armada that was called Invincible and which was crushingly defeated, which actually begins the story of the British domination of the seas over all oceans. Which is why all this happened for money when I tell you that some war did not start because of money. Do not believe them all. The waters always start for material reasons, but as historians explained them. For a long time, Russia interpreted the reasons for the Invincible Armada campaign in the sense that the development of capitalism in England led to the creation of a more progressive system that clashed economically with backward, feudal Spain, hindering free trade and the initial accumulation of English capitalists. And hence all these troubles with Drake and pirates with robberies of the Spanish silver fleets caused the wrath of King Philip I. The Invincible Armada campaign, but modern historical science, looking at things a little differently, not capitalism developing, gave rise to the modern state, which entered into war with each other. And on the contrary, the state gave rise to capitalism after work. The brothel became obvious that the centralization of power and grandiose spending stimulated the development of national markets of such countries as France, England, and this development heaving their lives has led to the rise of capitalist relations, including and due to the fact that absolute monarchs had to make grandiose loans. Debt slavery state budgets is disease 16th and 18th centuries, and probably contributed to the development credit, a percentage of the loan, and this loan capitalism, that the economist is clearly very powerful way accelerated the development of the market and production. Well-known example is that if the company is operation only on its own resources, and it will enter into competition with the company who will use the credit resources of Toga, who take loans for a very short time, leaving a thriving, but based on own funds. Far behind this is the basics of financial literacy. But 16th this century, no one new is started and begins with government loans, and why the government was forced to make the enormous size of the loan, where all of the debts of the world Spanish monarchy in front of the house Fugger and so on cause. Oddly lies in the development of military affairs at the turn of the rebirth of a new time. Is military technological revolution associated with the introduction of firearms? But it was expensive. Guns are so expensive that the government is waging war was forced to make large borrowing costs for a military. The operation has typically exceeded the annual budgets of entire countries, and from all this, the need to constantly borrow money once we take the money we have already entered the sphere of financial capitalism and went on to unwind, and the economic chain of causes and effects, so different countries have been the 16th century. In various provisions Spain's Spanish monarchy drew and resources necessary to perform its military revolution, especially in their colonies. It Inca gold and silver mines of the American France's richest country of Europe, and most developed in the late Middle Ages. It was just very much economically, but she's not having these silver mines, was not able to withstand a confrontation with the Habsburg monarchy in the 16th century. It suffered a defeat that led the French to a deep internal crisis known as the Huguenot Wars. But England is a small country on an island that was seriously inferior in population, not only to the French but also to the Spaniards. In England, there were about 2.5 million people, while in Spain there are about 7 to 8 million in France. The British found a way out in the robbery of the Spanish silver fleets, in piracy, in state robbery. Suffice it to say that in one of the years of the Drake corsairs and Queen Elizabeth brought 1,900 florins to the British treasury, which corresponded almost entirely to Spain's income from all over Italy of 2 million florins, and 4 times the income of the Spanish monarchy itself. There are 500,000 florins on the Iberian Peninsula, so do not underestimate the economic effect of the British pirate raids on British and Spanish convoys that transported silver from America, of course. If we are talking about a similar scale of robbery, then Spain she was extremely displeased, and in order to stop this robbery, Philip began to prepare their invincible armada was for war and ideologically, of course. If you have a material interest, you will have an ideology that will turn everything into a beautiful and noble form, and give your aspiration the character of a just struggle. The same happened with the Spanish, who fought for money, but thought they were fighting for their faith. In the 16th century, England became a Protestant country, while Spain became a stronghold of the Catholic faith. Philip believed that he was waging a holy war, a true crusade, truly national character, and in many ways, actually modern English nation has developed in this war. But the Spanish king did not think, he does not think about such things as people's opinion, because he led the monarchy composed of many tribes and states, and what sort of people he wanted is little concerned. But the Queen knew what that means to the citizens, because it has its own armed forces. For the meager resources of this realm was insignificant, and even your pirate expedition Queen had to carry out via private investors. A public-private partnership. Francis Drake and the company. Well, it's even more obvious in the story of Walter Raleigh, famous pirate of Her Majesty, who was the favorite queen of the partner and well, after he once brought from predatory raids Spanish possessions in America treasure in the amount of 3 higher than the state budget of England will be partner with Her Majesty. It is easy, and today would probably occurred in the Middle Ages, and served the Spaniards were preparing for war. For 3 long years, Philip was outfitted armada which originally was named Invincible, because never before has such a fleet was never seen before. But the plan initially was to actually. What was the plans of the parties and what were their powers? The Spaniards had planned the fleet collected Pires. The peninsula will fit in the English Channel, connecting in Flanders from the army, which was led by the famous commander Alexander Farnese, and Duke in Russian toggles through the strait in England this army, and from then on Spanish troops Invincible Terzi will do the trick mode and Elizabeth is cast out. Whether this plan venture stitch we neither was the Spanish army British. Nothing could oppose the strengthening of English at that time were obsolete medieval castles with thin walls that could not withstand the attack modern Armada siege weapons, and these heavy siege cannon ships of the Armada was carrying in its hold. As it became clear not long ago during excavations the breeze of the Irish coast, on the spot where he crushed one of the Spanish galleons and found these heavy guns are not needed, and is not in a naval battle anywhere except during the siege of fortresses. That means that the army should was to lay siege to, storm and take the English strongholds, in addition to 30 Spanish of the time, were the best troops in Europe. They already won. The French president is not fully in 1556, and if you have gained a formidable reputation in Italian wars, and the English did not have the land army in general, they had a little guard queen. Well, actually all the militia that time to cope with professional armies. Was not as if the Spanish army crossed the Strait of Fate. England probably would have solved. The chances of Philip was much more than that of William the Conqueror, who quartered the English Channel in 1066. No heralds. Anglo-Saxon gap. Military. The power of the Knights of William in his Gisca love was much less than weakness. The royal guard of the Queen of England and of the militia of the British face-trained battle-hardened Spanish warriors of the Duke Landlord. The fact that in England the fleet was strong navy, but Spain were collected armada strength, is much superior to the English, as the shield of Philip II of which was to provide a modest challenge. As Napoleon said, give me 3 days of good weather, and I win Anglais merely to cross the strait of the same. Then it will be 1940. Record your diary. Franz Holder. The nature of the Operation Sea Lion crossed the Great River. That's what was going. Armada consisted of 130 warships, but according to various estimates, from 128 to 131, but it is now accepted that 130 combat ships of the huge strengths of these ships has been specifically built 40 military courts, and 90 different sort of adapted because none of the country at that time. It was not possible to collect such a fleet clean military method, and the military navies of the then wasn't even in any fleet that were collected by the militia towns of the province mobilized merchant ships. All of this was going and went to war, but then you see as many as 40 were large warships built. On these ships were 2,430 guns. They were carrying the 30,500 people, of which 8,000 of sailors, 19,000 soldiers in fact. It was the fleet of amphibious operation, and it was built on the model of the word fleet following the victory of Lepanto. I've got a relevant video on the channel to serial film. Can view the Spaniards went to war with England as the victors of Lepanto and were prepared to the same battle that was against the Turks in the Mediterranean. It was the fleet designed for crushing board the ship after the terrible one artillery salvo. Therefore, the artillery from the Spanish ships were a motley variegated footage of what you want, and where on each ship the cores were piled up in a huge heap, and you had to choose the ones you needed in order to fire the cannon. These were special devices that allowed you to measure the fit of the core in the barrel. It was not the Spanish army, and he couldn't have her there to collect the resources of the monarchy. Such things were not allowed to do because it was not a national monarchy. A truly international the company today, music historians, as historians and Parking, and Kane and Amos, and the other. I point to the fact that it is in fact not national state, that all such events were cooperative efforts of different countries, Flanders, Italy, Germany, Spain, silver from America. All of this together should be combined, and after this is only something could be born, and the role of the Spaniards was here not so much. If we look at the nature of the Spanish search, the national character and let is there, the Spaniards practically was not. It was a universalist anarchy, which was originally in the hands of different nations. Look here, Columbus was a long month of Magellan. The Portuguese themselves travel would be impossible without the Italian, Portuguese, German cartographers and geographers. 7 of the 11 founders proudly Panama were foreigners who came along struggle coast or the South Pacific Ocean. Cortes and Pizarro were the Germans, and the Italians' agent South German Vizier Clare went to found down to Will, and with him on the ship were people of different dialects of Scotland, England, the Netherlands, but the table peplum Spaniards and Italians who, even in cases of extreme necessity, would not be able to understand each other. Is that the question of how any state now for the Americans, but with this Madurai and Chavez printing in me now we introduced a native Lombard trade. Of Spain ruled the Italian, Dutch, German merchants. It was carried out in Dutch, Portuguese and Genoese Basque ships. Finances of the Spanish monarchy was holding in my hands. At first, the Germans Fogger and then by the Genoese. The economy of Castilla, the end of the 16th century, was completely subordinated to the tasks service this giant transnational globalists, sky monarchs, and even the army, that it is a monarchy left was internationally in the battle present Crimeans in 1557, when he started the hegemony of Philip E of 35,000 soldiers. The Spaniards were only 12% of Germans, 53 Dutch, English 12, 23%, and incidentally among the generals was not a single Spaniard. The same will continue in the future of Lepanto of 203 galleries. The direct contribution of the Spanish galleys, 14 under the command of Varro de Bazan and the Duke de Santa Cruz. The remaining 63 of the Spanish galleys were Italian metrics from Naples and Sicily, 10, 11 Gene, 3 words, and so on, and from 28,000 soldiers, the Christian fleet. Spain gave 8,500 again of thousands of soldiers. Were Germans other benefits the Italians, and the same in all the other battles. that Spain introduced from the 16th to the early 17th century during the conquest of Portugal in 1580. The Cathy army, which operated in Flanders in 1608. There were 45% of Germans, 17% of Spaniards, 15% the Belgians, and 12% of Italian. But so on and so forth. Everything will be the same until the Battle of Merlin is a genius in 1634. When the Spanish infantry was the last time contains, great the victory of the Spaniards were part 5. And all the rest were Germans, motley mercenaries to countries, but get all the glory of course. The Spaniard they are the best, and this picture is known. Velasco, 100 delivery Breda of the Dutch fort, was taken by the Spaniards. 100 Years' War, but it was German-Belgian victory, the Spaniards. There were 10 interest on my desk with the words, again. We'll get the Spaniards. It happens in history. But we all know what time it was. The universal sky monarchy-oriented international enterprise, which did not take the interests included in the region's peoples. Then it is originally a motley force of, which is it was hard to organize, but most importantly no Castilla. Spain actually not been able to disembark in England own. But it was not just this possibility. So Philip II was to rely on an army of Flanders, content that it often money also lacked a fleet to send from Spain as a feature of the internal structure of Spain. Whether the Spaniards' chances of winning when they went camping, oddly enough the chances they had, and not just the nature of the fighting, was not as straightforward as often we have this tell. If I managed to connect with the ability Alexan Arni in the Russian army of the Duke of the Land in England, it would no longer be such a difficult task to watch the military operations in the Channel from this point. And so on May 9, 1588, the Invincible Armada solemnly departed from Lisbon after a huge service in the Lisbon Cathedral, where the Duke of Midian was presented with a banner illuminated by the Pope himself for the conquest of England. The troops were not informed that the Pope was tearing, and he hurled abuse at the Catholic king, who forced him to turn off his hands. Made up 1,000,000 florins to give out of the church treasury for his campaign of conquest. The Pope did not approve at all. He had completely different plans. But he kept quiet about it. Hurled abuse at the Catholic king, who forced him to turn off his hands. Made up 1,000,000 florins to give out of the church treasury for his campaign of conquest. The Pope did not approve at all. He had completely different plans, but he kept quiet about it. For several years, he knew the theater of military operations perfectly well, and he knew what kind of Twitter I was. Here, he immediately demanded that the comedians attack the English fleet on Sedan. But Udina Sidonia pulled out the King's order, which stated that the Armada must strictly follow the English Channel until joining the army of the Duke of Po-Russian, and then ensure the transfer of this army to the English coast to engage in ski raids, and the British coast was strictly prohibited before this task was completed, and Midian subsidence forbade it. The Spanish fleets sailed majestically past Plymouth, while the British pulled their ships through the narrow neck of Plymouth Bay and went to the Spaniards to windward. They won the wind actually by the Spaniard, because they themselves gave it, and the following battles throughout the week. While the Armada sailed through the English Channel, the British dominated the wind. Not only were their ships faster and better adapted to navigate in the rough and changeable waters of the English Channel, but they also dominated the whole time, controlled the wind. You say Spanish Armada. This was doomed. Not yet, oddly enough. The Spanish were still, despite a strategic setback with the wind, extremely formidable force. They lined up in order of battle as of Lepanto in crescent at the same. The main forces were in the center, and on both sides stood still powerful combat squadron blows with the best commanders. And here is the monthly Armada loose slowly floated party Posdicale. The British windward side attacked him and were constantly fighting in the strait, and found out that the English guns at all of progressivity, their new naval tactics. Nothing Spanish Armada can not do. The fighting was constantly They went from the 30th of July to 2 August 3, then 4 August. Some of the White August 5, and every day, these battles were carried out artillery duel. When the British fired a huge Spanish fleet, and the Spaniards were trying to go on the counterattack, but more maneuverable British ships fast, with the advantages on a windy location, easily went under, and the Spaniards continued their fire. Well, turns out that this is a long gave 3 shots on one Spanish in the distance, but the shot did not bring significant damage to the Spanish Navy and Squadron Medina Gray, and continued connection with the army of the Duke of Formes, who the weather was not very favorable to the Spaniards, and the second critical moment happened. When the Spanish fleet was about the Isle of Wight, he sailed through the strait. To the shores of the Isle of Wight there are convenient bays where they could settle, repair to stock up on water. To establish a foothold on this island, agree to have final say on the timing. Like to connect with the army, Herz-Coppery will receive the first message that the Armada is coming, when it will be already in the stake on the 6th of August. Before any information from the sailing of the Armada had no, it was more than another example of such a poor communication between the two groups of troops who were to work together to implement common operations, as an example of the Spanish Armada, which had no operational relationship with the flank of the Russian army of the Duke of Parma. And this will be one of the main reasons why the Armada eventually lose. Not English tactic is not the superiority of the English artillery, it's nothing British oddly not give. They will be pinching the railing. Armada will slowly incapacitate the ships of the Spaniards, but decisive success they still will not be. The fact that the Spanish Armada will strictly observe the order of battle, and then while this crescent terrible, it will be to keep all the attacks on Ceuta will be nothing they will not succeed to do with the Spanish fleet, included in yourself. Understood more. It turned out that they go fight. There is something, even some success, local wind loss is applied to the Spaniards. The Spaniards inexorably approaching the stake where to meet them out the army of the Duke of Pap. And what happens then? Well, I did not expect the Duke in Russian and Spanish Navy saying that he had not wanted this. The expedition didn't want, being a professional and very talented military commander. He knew that landing operation in England meant a huge risk in order to implement it. He also knew that we needed a deepwater port on the shore of the English Channel, which Spain was not. Philip II reason believed that France will provide the port, that the Duke's army and navy to join in the French port of Boulogne, and the French refused to allow this kind of operation. Is not to fight the French, but still do not know how things will turn out. So King Philip, of course, at the narrowest point on Parkinson's law, gave crashing, but yet again, nothing was lost in the dream. Was that the Duke just didn't know when to prepare the troops. He had 300 barges were prepared on the coast of Flanders for landing. These were not barges, but warships. The Dutch fleet blocked. Things will turn out so. King Philip, of course, at the narrowest point on Parkinson's law, gave crashing, but yet again, nothing was lost in the dream. Was that the Duke just didn't know when to prepare the troops. He had 300 barges were prepared on the coast of Flanders for landing. These were not barges, but warships. The Dutch fleet blocked the coast. We lit them up much earlier than necessary, so most likely they wouldn't even have been able to hit anyone at all. If the Spaniards had kept their composure, they started chopping ropes. Why did it happen 2 nights ago? Confusion, but most importantly, there were a lot of veterans of the Battle of Antwerp in the Spanish army. When an Italian engineer arrived in the army of the Duke of Formes, whom he offered his services to, and the Duke abruptly sent him to the forest, and then the offended Italian modelled on the famous Hungarian gunsmith Orban, who also in 1453 first offered his services to the Byzantines, and after their refusal sided with the Turkish Sultan and cast him the largest cannon that crashed into Constantinople. Just like the Italian, he went over to the Dutch side, and for the first time in the world, He built a time bomb on the scale of an entire ship bomb. There were several tons of gunpowder, all of it encased in iron ingots, chains, and tombstones. That these fire ships are bombs. The ships are bombs. That they are now scattering their entire fleet. They began to cut down anchor ropes in a panic, and the wind began to blow them into the North Sea. The fact is that the loss of a real main anchor for ships of that time is a very serious problem, especially on the shaky shores of the North Sea, the shaky shores of Flanders, where the soils and so on they don't hold their anchors well. And here the Spaniards also lost their main anchors, and were able to stand on additional anchors at night after the fire ships attacked the raid. Since they only had 5 large galleons, and it was on them that the British fleet would fall in the morning, while all the other ships of the Armada would be scattered over a large area. They say that's what happened next. It's not over, it's just started. The Great Battle of Grabley began, which is described as the triumph of the British fleet and the defeat of the invincible Armada. And this is also not true because the Spaniards withstood the British attack. The British divided their forces for squadron and Howard Paul one of these, from which to capture the flagship of the galleon G. Angelisa Alisa of San Lorenzo, which previous battle suffered heavy losses, ran aground and was a tasty the piece. He was the flagship. There were treasures, and the heart of an English admiral withstood money talks. It's got a whole of the British rushed to the dirt, and though it guns with one side looking at the water with the other in the sky, he unsuccessfully ran aground. The commander of the wheel refused to surrender and fought to the last. And that is what the desperate resistance of the Spanish sailors gave the opportunity to the rest of the fleet to attack the Drake and the other 3 British, and say, having Sasa on top 5 galleons media of the Duke of Sidonia. The Spanish fought like lions. They was worthy of the glory of his victories. Put the earth the sea. There were also many such episodes such as the galleon San Mateo was riddled British shells to the fact that he could barely keep his on the water. The fact that Drake, he also took the risk. He realized that the firing from long range only leads to incompetent spends gunpowder eat, and he moved closer at a distance of 100 meters in the distance, when a prominent whites of the eyes of the enemy, when the gun to fire at the enemy, and there was discharged in the Spaniard gun from his side. The Spaniard said after breaking the British flagship, and then the Spaniards attacked the other ships, which they began to discharge their artillery Spanish galleon, and that the body itself was well like a sieve, but it is a sieve. Did not give up. He fought and repulsed the attacks of the British, until it eventually took on the rocks of Flanders, where he collapsed as a result of the storms. The ship was lost only by the Spanish in this time the battle. During the battle what the British are up to PM defeat of the Armada, but came in the midst of battle. A barrage of only 15 a minute squall, but some of you probably know what it is, even I, a land rat who lives in a steppe town. Once in my life saw a white squall in a squall when a terrible wind suddenly struck the participants of a sailing regatta in Saratov and sank most of the yachts in 15 minutes. I can imagine what it looks like at sea. The British needed you. They had no time for the Spaniards to rush and save their ships, their sailing rigging, and avoid a collision. And when the squall had passed, the Armada had already gathered in battle formation, and the formidable Spanish formation was still unshakable, and it became clear that the British would not break it nevertheless. The result of the Battle of the Barrier, where the British could not win but achieve some success, was the fact that the Spanish Armada began to drift into the North Sea in the wind and currents. Here is a map of that time showing that the winds were blowing, and you can see that the wind was blowing so that the ships were not anchored. The Spaniards had spent 9/10 of the powder, and there was little left. It became clear that the British would not break it nevertheless. The result of the Battle of the Barrier, where the British could not win but achieve some success, was the fact that the Spanish Armada began to drift into the North Sea in the wind and currents. Here is a map of that time showing that the winds were blowing. And you can see that the wind was blowing so that the ships were not anchored. The Spaniards had spent 9/10 of the powder, and there was little left. The waters of the famous Spanish were picked up by Alonso, who was given it, who fought valiantly during the campaign. And now Alonso was given it. Alonso was given his death off the coast of Ireland, which in itself is a death. There is a story called Fate. After the death of the flagship, Alonso gave it Lara is the Santa Maria in Corrado, on which he was from the very beginning of the campaign. He and a group of crew members landed on the Irish coast in the Bacolio's herring capacity of 600 tons, or very probably Girona still 50 guns, whether his companions once again decided to flip a coin. To test your luck, to tempt fate. Within 2 weeks after reaching this, Goliath repairing severely damaged the ship eventually went to sea, but the Lord turned away from him. This ship died, and already this time famous Spanish admiral did not survive. He too was killed. Remnants of the Armada returned to Spain, and usually say that the result, hiking Invincible Armada, was the transfer of the title of Mistress of the Seas to England. Yes, it's true, the end of the war is still far not soon. In the first, immediately after the defeat of the Invincible Armada, the British turned to pride and joy, decided to finish off the Spanish fleet, made a trip to the English Armada already to Spain the following year. They sent squadron under the command of the famous Drake Passage, which ended in a complete disaster. The campaign cost a lot of money. The British chipped, collected his armada, and the result: 60 English armed vessels of 14 ships. It was lost during a storm. A few during the battle with Azami. English armada was defeated. Also to the Spanish, Philip II was greeted by the message, the defeat of the Flavors, from a stoic calm, and ordered to prepare another armada. And in 1590 there is armada back out to sea again, and were scattered by the storm. 1596 Spain as a result went bankrupt not less than, and after the death of Philip running them on inertia naval machine, continued to work. In 1601 another Spanish armada heading out to sea, a landing in Ireland, but the Spaniards so there will manifest itself the Irish, which very quickly will be to consider them as the worst enemies of which the English, and end all disaster and the capture 61,000 Spanish troops on the green could. And only in 1604, the new King of England, James, son of Mary Stuart, and the new Spanish King Philip III, conclude peace among themselves on the basis of Spain's recognition of the Protestant monarchy in England and the British's refusal to support piracy, which the British would not carry out, but it would be later the Armada, which was called Invincible on. In fact, it turned out to be defeated not so much by the British as by God, but by the weather conditions. On the other hand, King Philip had to understand that he was sending a fleet, including Mediterranean ships, through the Bay of Biscay, the most stormy sea area in Europe. And what else did he wanted? James, son of Mary Stuart, and the new Spanish King Philip III conclude peace among themselves on the basis of Spain's recognition of the Protestant monarchy in England and the British's refusal to support piracy, which the British would not carry out, but it would be later the Armada, which was called Invincible on. In fact, it turned out to be defeated not so much by the British as by God, but by the weather conditions. On the other hand, King Philip had to understand that he was sending a fleet, including Mediterranean ships, through the Bay of Biscay, the most stormy sea area in Europe. And what else did he want?